At 7:32 a.m. on February 10th, 1942, Lieutenant Commander John Thach sat in his cockpit above Wake Island, eyes scanning the horizon for a glint of silver or sunlight that didn't belong. The ocean below shimmered under the rising Pacific sun, a deceptive calm before violence. His fingers tightened around the stick as he spotted 6 specks in the distance, black dots against the gold sky. They grew larger by the second, Japanese Zeros, 6 of them, slicing downward like falcons on prey. His 4 Wildcats held formation, their propellers spinning steady and sure, but Thach knew the math. 4 against 6 wasn't odds, it was a death sentence. The Japanese pilots had altitude, speed, and a machine that outclassed his in every measurable way. The Wildcat was heavy, underpowered, and stubborn in a climb. The Zero was a ghost light, agile, and built to turn inside you until its guns chewed through your fuselage. The Japanese pilots knew it. The Americans knew it. The Pacific sky had already proved it too many times. 43 Wildcats lost in head-to-head dogfights with Zeros since the new year began, 43 funerals, 43 telegrams home. Every battle followed the same tragic pattern. An American pilot spotted a Zero, turned to engage, tried to fight on equal terms. 14 seconds later, the Zero was on his tail. 14 seconds more, and the Wildcat was burning, its pilot gone. Command knew it too, but they didn't have an answer. Their orders were mechanical and cruel. Avoid turning engagements, run if possible. But running meant abandoning your wingman, leaving another man alone against the sky. No pilot could stomach that. So they turned, they fought, and they died. Thach was 37, a veteran of the Navy's early carrier squadrons, respected for his calm and precision. 214 hours in Wildcats, 0 kills. He'd seen good men vanish in orange fireballs, men who trusted him to lead, to find a way out of the impossible. He had no answer for the Zero's climb rate, no counter for its turning radius. Nothing but the helpless ritual of watching pilots die. 3 days earlier, back at Naval Air Station San Diego, he'd been sitting in his quarters staring at a box of matches his wife had sent from home. A small, ordinary box, 20 thin wooden sticks inside a cardboard sleeve printed with a California diner logo. He'd been brooding over the Zero problem for weeks, turning over every possibility in his mind. How do you fight something faster, lighter, more agile? How do you win when every rule of aerial combat says you're already beaten? He took out 2 matches, held them parallel, then moved them so they crossed and recrossed. A tiny flicker of insight sparked in his mind. What if fighters didn't fight alone? What if 2 Wildcats flew as one, not separate hunters, but a pair that covered each other's weaknesses? What if, when a Zero locked onto one Wildcat's tail, that pilot turned toward his wingman instead of away? They'd cross paths, and the Zero chasing one would fly straight into the guns of the other. A moving, interlocking pattern, a weave. He sat back, staring at the 2 matches, imagining the pattern of motion in the sky. The concept defied every manual, every rule written since 1918. Doctrine said fighters fought individually. Even in a pair, the moment combat began, each pilot broke off to engage his own target. That was gospel. That was how it had always been done. But doctrine hadn't faced the Zero. Doctrine hadn't buried 43 pilots. That night, Thach called his wingman, Lieutenant Edward Butch O'Hare, into his quarters. He laid the matches on the table, demonstrated the crossing pattern. O'Hare stared, said nothing for half a minute, then asked the only question that mattered. When do we try it? Now, 4 days later, they were about to find out if 2 matches could rewrite the laws of aerial combat. The 6 Zeros were closing fast 200 yards out, diving from 11,000 feet. Thach's hand tightened on the radio trigger. "Weave on my mark," he said. Lieutenant G. Edward Bassett, his wingman for this mission, flew 800 feet off his right wing. 2 more Wildcats ensigns, Daniel Sheedy and Edgar Coulson, held another 1,000 feet beyond. 4 Wildcats, a thin blue line against the rising sun, Standard Navy orders in this situation were simple. Split up. Fight alone. But Thach had decided that old rules didn't apply anymore. Bassett, on me, he called. Weave pattern, execute. Bassett acknowledged immediately. He turned his Wildcat toward Thach. Thach turned toward him. The two aircraft aimed nose to nose, closing fast, their altimeters dropping as the Japanese formation howled closer from above. To an observer, it probably looked insane, two American fighters on a collision course. But at 400 yards they banked hard, passing within 200 feet of each other. Then they kept turning, each looping back around to cross again. From above, the pattern traced a figure-8 two airplanes weaving through each other's flight paths, never colliding, always converging. The lead Zero picked Bassett as his prey. The Japanese pilot dove into a tail chase, confident, closing the gap. 600 yards, 500, 400. His 20mm cannons were primed. The Zero's advantage was maneuverability. It could pivot around the Wildcat like a hawk around a crow. The pilot probably expected Bassett to brake hard and try to run, but Bassett didn't run. He turned into Thach. The Zero followed, lining up the shot, 3 seconds to kill range. But then Thach's Wildcat came screaming in from the opposite side of the weave, guns already blazing. 6. 50 caliber Brownings erupted 70 rounds a second, tearing through the sky. The Zero pilot had a split second to decide, pull up or die. He broke off, climbing sharply, tracer rounds shredding past his canopy. The other 5 Zeros scattered, their leaders near death rattling their confidence. Sheedy and Coulson saw what happened and instantly copied the maneuver. Another Zero latched onto Coulson's tail and Sheedy turned into him, firing a burst that clipped the Zero's right wing. The Japanese fighter jerked upward, smoke trailing behind. The dogfight lasted 6 minutes, 6 eternity-long minutes of screaming engines and tracer arcs against the morning light. 6 Zeros against 4 Wildcats. The expected outcome was 4 dead Americans. Instead, when the last Zero climbed away and fled northwest, all 4 Wildcats were still in the air. No hits, no losses. When Thach landed at Ford Island 40 minutes later, his hands shook uncontrollably, not from fear, but from adrenaline and from the weight of realization. The weave had worked. He wrote the combat report that afternoon, describing every detail, the crossing paths, the reversal turns, the shooting geometry. He requested immediate adoption fleet-wide. The reply came 3 days later. Interesting tactic, needs further testing, not approved for widespread use. Thach read the memo 3 times, jaw tight. 43 pilots dead, and headquarters wanted further testing. But time wasn't waiting. The Japanese weren't waiting. Within 2 months, they would attack an island halfway between Midway and Tokyo, and the weave would face its ultimate test. Between February and June, Thach drilled his squadron relentlessly. Morning flights, afternoon flights, night training when the moon was bright enough to see the horizon. His men practiced until they could fly the weave blindfolded. Turn toward your wingman, cross, turn again. Never lose visual contact. The Navy still hadn't formally approved it, but Thach didn't need permission to save his pilots. He showed them the matches, drew diagrams on chalkboards, taught the geometry. If a Zero gets on your tail, he said, you turn into your wingman, make him choose follow you into the other man's guns or break off. Either way, you live. Some got it right away. Others thought he was crazy. One senior commander told him bluntly, you can't fly toward another aircraft in combat. You'll kill each other before the enemy does. But Thach kept teaching, because every week brought more funerals. 91 Wildcats lost by May, 91 pilots who'd never come home. Then, in late May, codebreakers at Station Hypo intercepted Japanese communications. Admiral Yamamoto was planning the largest carrier operation in history, an attack on Midway Island. 4 Japanese carriers, over 270 aircraft. The attack date, June 4th. Admiral Chester Nimitz summoned every available ship to Pearl Harbor. The Americans would have 3 carriers, Yorktown, Enterprise, and Hornet. The math was grim, outnumbered, outflown, outgunned. Fighting Squadron 3 received deployment orders on May 26th. They were assigned to the Yorktown. That night, Thach gathered his 7 pilots on the hangar deck. The carrier engines throbbed beneath their feet. He placed the same 2 matches on a map of the Pacific. "The Japanese are bringing 50 Zeros to Midway," he said quietly. "We'll have maybe 8 Wildcats. If this works, we live. If it doesn't, we die." One pilot asked, "What if the weave fails, sir?" Thach smiled thinly and slid the matches together again. "Then we burn together, not alone." Yorktown sailed from Pearl Harbor on May 30th, 4 days to Midway, 4 days before history. On June 4th, 1942, at 9:30 a.m., Thach climbed to 14,000 feet over Yorktown. Below, the blue Pacific stretched to infinity. His radio crackled with reports. Inbound Japanese strike group, 18 dive bombers, 12 Zeros escorting. He counted his own force. 4 Wildcats, odds 3-1. The Zeros appeared like silver needles in the sun, diving from 15,000 feet, the standard Japanese tactic. Use altitude, dive fast, dominate before the Americans can react. Thach's voice came calm over the radio. "Weave pattern. Execute on my mark." Bassett, 600 feet to his right, replied, "Roger, ready." 2 more Wildcats followed behind, waiting for the cue. The Zeros committed. 3 broke for Thach. 4 went for Bassett. The rest streaked toward Yorktown, engines howling. "Mark, execute." Thach turned hard toward Bassett. Bassett turned toward him. They crossed at 12,000 feet, tracers flashing between them as the first Zeros dove in. For a moment, the sky became chaos, intersecting contrails, flashing sunlight, bullets ripping through air. The first Zero overshot his dive, tried to bank around. Thach caught him mid-turn. 6. 50 Carls roared. The Zero burst into fire and fell in a spiral. Thach's first confirmed kill, but the other 2 didn't break. They'd learned from the morning's reports, adapted on the fly. 1 climbed, 1 dove, attacking from opposite angles. Thach pulled up toward the high Zero. Bassett swung down toward the low one. The weave fractured the one thing Thach feared. At 800 yards, the high Zero opened fire. 20mm cannon shells ripped through Thach's left wing. 2 rounds punched through the metal near his cockpit, one slicing past his head close enough for him to feel the shockwave. "Bassett, status!" he barked. "I'm hit," came the reply. "Engines leaking." Thach saw white coolant streaming from Bassett's tail. The low Zero was still behind him, hammering away. Thach made the split-second decision. Break his own attack, dive to protect Bassett. He rolled inverted, dropped toward the 2. The Zero chasing Bassett never saw him coming. Thach opened fire from 500 yards, a long controlled burst. The Japanese plane erupted, fragments spinning into the sea. Bassett's engine was overheating. "I'm heading back to Yorktown," he said. "Go," Thach ordered. "You're done." That left Thach alone, 11,000 feet above a sky still full of Zeros. 10 of them remained. He turned toward Yorktown, scanning for friendly aircraft. 4 Wildcats from another squadron were 3 miles east too far. 3 Zeros broke from formation and came for him. He had no wingman, no weave, no help. He could run, but that would lead them straight to the carrier. And Thach wasn't built to run. He keyed the radio. "Engaging 3 Zeros solo. If it works, you'll see proof. If it doesn't." He paused, voice steady. "Tell my wife I love her." He turned toward the oncoming fighters. At 9,000 feet, tracers stitched the air around him. The lead Zero opened fire, but Thach wasn't flying predictably. He realized something crucial in that moment. The weave wasn't about 2 planes. It was about motion. It was geometry, energy, rhythm. He turned hard, right then, reversed left, instantly. Sharp, jarring, unpredictable movements. The Zero overshot, corrected, Burned energy to keep up. Thach reversed again. Right, then left. Each reversal forced the Zero to overcompensate. After 40 seconds, the lead Zero lost its altitude advantage, bleeding speed until it was co-level with Thach. No more superiority. The Japanese pilot broke off, confused. The other two followed, retreating to regroup. Thach had survived alone using nothing but instinct and the principles of his own invention. When he landed on Yorktown 20 minutes later, he found Bassett safe on deck. His Wildcat had 4 bullet holes, but the engine still turned. Every pilot on the carrier heard about the fight before lunch. The Weave worked even solo. By that evening, pilots from Enterprise and Hornet were visiting Thach's ready room, asking for explanations. He showed them the matches, drew loops and crossings on the map table, told them what mattered most. You never let him dictate the fight. By June 5th, 18 Wildcat pilots could perform the pattern. By June 6th, 32. The tactics spread faster than any official doctrine ever had. Intercepted Japanese radio messages from June 7th contained a new phrase: American fighters are fighting in pairs. They no longer fly alone. They weave unpredictably. Expect strong resistance. For the first time, the Japanese feared the Wildcats. By the morning of June 7th, 1942, the sea around Midway was littered with wreckage. Oil slicks stretched for miles, grey-black ribbons on blue water. Bits of metal floated among life rafts and burning fuel. The 4 Japanese carriers that had begun the battle, Akagi, Kaga, Soru and Hiru, now lay beneath the Pacific. The Americans had lost one, Yorktown. But the balance of power in the Pacific had changed forever. Thach stood on the deck of the destroyer Hamon, which had pulled him from the water after Yorktown was hit. His face was wind-burned, his flight suit torn and salt-stained, but his eyes were alive. He watched the smoke drift from the horizon and felt no joy, only the quiet, stunned understanding that something immense had shifted. The Japanese were no longer unstoppable. The war had turned, not because of numbers or luck, but because men refused to die by the same mistake twice. 2 days earlier, he had sat in the ready room after landing, surrounded by pilots who'd survived the impossible. They'd flown through fire and lived because of a simple idea drawn from 2 matches. None of them said the word victory. They just sat there, hands shaking, eyes distant. Lieutenant Bassett came in later, limping slightly, his flight gear scorched at the edges. He dropped into the seat next to Thach. "You realize," he said after a while, "they're going to write this up in every training manual from now on." Thach shook his head. "They'll give it a name first." They did. 3 weeks later, the official report called it the Thach Weave. The Bureau of Aeronautics sent out memoranda to every fleet carrier, every training squadron, every new class of naval aviators. Effective immediately, the directive read, pilots are to be trained in the Thach Weave, a coordinated 2-plane defensive maneuver proven effective against superior enemy aircraft. The reports spread faster than Thach could read them. Instructors at Pensacola were already teaching it by July. The Marine squadrons at Guadalcanal practiced it daily. Even the Army Air Forces, whose P-42s were suffering heavy losses in the Solomons, adapted the tactic to their twin-wing formations. But Thach wasn't interested in fame or doctrine. His focus stayed with his men. He visited the training decks, corrected their timing, flew demonstration flights himself. "You turn too early, you die," he'd tell them. "You turn too late, you die. But if you trust your wingman, you live." He spoke quietly, never theatrically. Pilots listened not because he outranked them, but because he'd been there, because he'd survived what none of them had yet faced. By autumn 1942, his squadron had rotated out of combat. They'd done their duty, and most had survived. Not all, though. Coulson went missing off Guadalcanal. Sheedy's Wildcat was last seen gliding toward the sea after a fight over Tulagi. Thach kept their names on a slip of paper in his flight log. He wrote their families by hand, every letter a piece of his soul pressed onto paper. "Your son fought bravely," he'd begin, "and his courage saved lives. He was not alone in the sky. Each time, his handwriting grew slower, more deliberate, as if the weight of loss seeped into every curve of the ink. In 1943, the US Navy began replacing the Wildcat with the F4F Hellcat, bigger, faster, more powerful. A machine designed specifically to counter the Zero. It could climb higher, turn tighter, and carry twice the ammunition. But Thach knew technology alone wouldn't win the war. Tactics did. Trust did. When the Hellcats met the Zeros over the Philippine Sea in June 1944, the result was slaughter. 315 Japanese aircraft destroyed for the loss of 29 Americans. The press called it the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. But to the men who flew that day, it wasn't luck or superiority, it was discipline. Every pair of Hellcats flew the weave. Every pilot moved in rhythm with his partner, crossing, reversing, firing in perfect synchronization. The pattern that had been born from 2 matches on a desk in San Diego now filled the sky from Saipan to Guam. After the battle, Admiral Nimitz called Thach to his flagship. "Your idea saved hundreds of lives," he said simply. Thach just nodded. "It wasn't mine alone," he replied. It belonged to every man who trusted another enough to turn toward him instead of away. When the war ended in 1945, Thach returned home to San Diego. His hair was greyer, his voice quieter, but his eyes hadn't lost that steady focus. The war had taken friends, years, and more sleepless nights than he could count, yet he carried no bitterness. He carried only memory, and the belief that survival was never an accident. He continued flying, testing new aircraft, teaching younger pilots. In the classrooms at Pensacola, he'd stand before rows of cadets and draw 2 crossing lines on the blackboard, then look up and say, "That's the difference between dying alone and living together." The cadets would nod, not fully understanding. Only combat could make those words real. By the 1,950 seconds, the Navy had jets the F-9F Panther, the F-2H Banshee, then the F-J Fury. Sleek, screaming machines that bore little resemblance to the stubby Wildcats of Midway. Yet, even in jet training, the weave remained a core maneuver. Instructors still used Thach's name. He was promoted steadily, quietly, rising to Rear Admiral by the time Korea erupted. He never sought the spotlight. He never gave speeches about glory or heroism. His stories, when told, were measured, almost gentle. He spoke of precision, of teamwork, of how fear and trust could coexist in a cockpit no larger than a closet. Younger officers admired him but found him hard to read. He didn't joke much, didn't drink with the others. He preferred walking the hangar decks at night, checking maintenance crews, running his hands along the cold metal of aircraft fuselages as if they were old friends. Sometimes he'd stop and stare at the wing of a plane under the yellow glow of deck lights. "You know," he once told a young lieutenant, "metal remembers. Every stress line, every vibration. You can't see it, but it's there. Same with men." In 1960, during a lecture at the Naval War College, he was asked by a student what the hardest part of Midway had been. He thought for a long time before answering. "It wasn't fear," he said at last. "You stop feeling fear after the first dive. It was deciding to trust someone else with your life every 15 seconds. The weave only works if both men believe in it completely. That's the hardest thing, to turn toward danger because you believe someone else is turning toward you." The room was silent after that. He retired in 1967, settling with his wife in Coronado. The Navy named a building after him the next year. But honors never mattered to him. What mattered were the letters he still received from pilots he'd trained. Letters that said, "Sir, I used your weave. It worked. I came home." In 1988, long after his name had faded from headlines, Thach visited the Naval Aviation Museum in Pensacola. He walked slowly through the exhibits until he found the Wildcat on display, pale blue paint, 6 .50 caliber guns, compact, ugly, and perfect in its own way. He stood there for a while, hand resting on the wing. Nearby, a group of young recruits were gathered around a display board that described the Thach Weave. One of them read aloud, "Invented by Lieutenant Commander John S. Thach, February 1942. Used successfully in the Battle of Midway and throughout the Pacific." The recruit turned, saw the older man standing there, and asked, "Sir, were you in the war?" Thach smiled faintly. "Once," he said, "a long time ago." The boy grinned. "Did you ever fly one of these?" Thach looked at the Wildcat one last time, the ghost of sunlit clouds reflected in its paint. "Yes," he said, "and she never let me down." He walked away then, slow but steady, the echo of propellers and ocean wind lingering somewhere behind him. The weave lived on. It became more than a tactic, it became a symbol, not just of combat skill, but of faith between men in the sky. Every generation of naval aviators learned it, practiced it, passed it down. Jets, missiles, radar, everything changed, but that principle endured. Turn toward your wingman, because somewhere, above some ocean, in some future war, another pilot would hear the same words in his headset, calm, steady, unafraid, weave on my mark, and he'd know that he wasn't alone.